There goes.
That is the theme from the greatest World War II game ever, Battlefield. I'm annoyed Renegade got it so quickly.
You didn't? I thought you mentioned it.
No, I don't think I did. Now, points to Renegade.
Oh,
Points,
wait, no, never.
Points to Renegade if he knows which Battlefield that was from. Now we're doing something a little bit different here. I don't know what went wrong in terms of the stream, but one of the reasons the stream's a little bit behind is I've hopefully set it up in a way so that I won't have to restart anything. First off, I'm running it off of a different browser. And second off, I don't have the slideshow full screen for me. I just have it cropped in. So basically what we were doing last time, where I'm scrolling through the slides, but you don't have to see me scrolling through the slides. It looks as if it's full screen for you. And also, I realized I can keep my mouse off screen now as well by doing that. So, I'm excited for
So
this
this
one.
is the moment of truth.
This is it
Let's see. Let's see if your slides work.
for the big one. This is, um, yeah, this is the big episode. I think every episode from here on, I think, is significant. If you have, uh, you know, oh, tell your friends and family about the IAA Tragedy and Hope stream. You know, if if this is if this is the first episode someone listens to, I still think it works because this is chapters 13, 14 and 15, and every chapter from here on out is significant because this is when the world order changes, right? This is when
Mm.
the system that has been growing. We've been looking at the coalescing of the system that is the tragedy and a hope of our civilization in this third age of conflict, right? Just to remind you, if you want to know Quigley's model of civilizations, go and watch episode 1. People forget to talk about the evolution of civilizations in reference to Tragedy and Hope. Tragedy and Hope is a very expanded history of a stage of our civilization. And the other stages and how that fits into everything else is in his book, The Evolution of Civilizations. And it's very worth reading. It's an enjoyable book once you get past the first 20 or 30%, which is quite sort of dry philosophy, his like philosophy of various things. But so today is the Second World War, and from the Second World War onwards, the system is dominant. Where it's no longer in this conflict between liberalism, fascism, and communism. This shows why a pluralist economy that's predominantly liberal, I think, is the way to characterize it. Why that operates today, because it is the one that could win a war, and it is able to win a war. We'll see for a number of reasons, but after this, we've got 5 more chapters, and I think each one of them, whereas the first half of the series was a bit sort of like, where is this going? Where is this going? I think the inflection point was around chapter 13, 14. Was it last week or the week before that we did the episode that we talk about the development of the arms, the military, the proto military industrial complex, and how that forms out of the Great
Yeah,
Depression.
that was last week.
So how that forms out of the Great Depression is the first chapter. It's like, oh, for me it was like, oh, World War II. I know most of the stuff that he talks about from World War II, but from here on out, I think it's very much it's very interesting. But yeah.
Go to the first slide, by the way.
So just
From your intro, I have a question as well.
yeah.
Do you think that liberalism, more than any other ideology, can be twisted to mean whatever the heck the elite want it to mean?
Insofar as like it's vague and it's dependent upon the support of the populace, at least
Yeah.
nominally, than fascism and communism. Though within like fascism and within fascism, National Socialism, they can just do whatever they want.
Yeah.
But I think what it shows is that having deluded people who are drugged on consumerism produces a better system, a more efficient system than, a harder version of slavery. So it's like softer slavery works better than harder slavery, but they're still both slavery, right? Like you don't need chattel slaves picking cotton anymore because you've got wage slaves, and wage slaves are a kinder, gentler, thing. But the system works better, but it still wants you enslaved. Now, I this just thought I'd put this picture in. This is a picture of Jeff and me from the Second World War when we were watching on from the sidelines.
Colorized. 1944 colorized.
Not many people know about the flying tanks. that were developed. Uh, so anyway, so tragedy and hope. That's a bit low. I think it should be a bit more. There we go. I like that better. Tragedy and hope. 11. Second World War. A Bucklander lecture series. So just to recap, the last episode we looked at appeasement, the way that that things were happening with Japan in East Asia, Italy in Africa, and Germany in Europe, and how they were making these grabs. I'm reading a book by a guy named Paul Kennedy, and Paul Kennedy calls these three the revisionist powers. How the revisionist powers are making land grabs. Hitler wants this war. Hitler's trying to get a war. He's frustrated when he can't actually get a war over Czechoslovakia because he thinks he's gonna win, even though Quigley says like no, actually the Czechs, if they'd put up a fight, could have maybe actually beaten the Germans at that point. That is a contentious thing to say, controversial thing to say. I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. There is definitely a myth around Germany in the Second World War. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. But like, there's this myth of like German excellence in the Second World War. Why that's the case, I'll talk about. Now there's a danger here. Today, so chapter 14 and 15, Second World War. This is the last bit of text really that you're going to see. I've tried to keep it very visual because largely there's not a lot of like Quigley hard theory here. This is a very historical chapter that doesn't really tell us anything new. It's just part of the book, and there's lots of good, and also it's well documented, all these pictures. But there's a danger here that I can get bogged down in this too much. So I'm gonna try and keep moving throughout this. But like, I could easily spend 1,000 hours slowly picking apart the Second World War from a military nerd perspective, but I'm not going to do that now. I'm just going to try to keep it moving. If I get bogged down, poke me and tell me, and I'll try and I'll get back on track. Yeah. Did you have wait? Did you see that there was a question? Did I ignore the question or?
No. You already answered it.
Okay. So, chapter 13 ends. Hitler's going into Poland. So, here we can see the map of Germany. People sometimes forget that there was that little bit of Germany that survived in East Prussia. That is now Kaliningrad, and is controlled by Russia still. Apparently, at the end of the Cold War, the Russians tried to give it back to Germany or to Poland, and both Germany and Poland were like, "No, dude, we don't want that. You've destroyed that city." Königsberg was one of the great cities of Europe, and the Russians have destroyed it, and nobody wants it, and I don't think the Russians are going to give it back now. But you can see they go in, Germans invade. They've got part of Slovakia down there at this point, and they come in from that sort of Brandon, Pomerania, and East Prussia, and that is those tanks there are Panzer IIs going through Poland. I don't know anything more about what unit that is, but one of the things that happens is at this time is Germany's not particularly well mobilized. It's one of the reasons why Hitler said Slovakia could have beaten Czechoslovakia, because Czechoslovakia was actually like fully mobilized to go to war. They were just waiting for the British and French to give them the nod. The Germans are not. And the British and French struggle to mobilize. The British and French give an ultimatum. They draw the line at Poland. The Germans go in. Chamberlain says you have 24 hours to get out or whatever. And if we don't hear from them by noon, we're going to consider ourselves in a state of war with Germany. I'm not sure the French even bother with that. And sure enough, that's ignored. So Britain goes to war. Now, one of the things is that the British and French are not totally prepared for this, and the Germans are. And the Germans have time to work up, but they're not as well mobilized as they could be. But what Quigley says is the major advantage Hitler has in getting Germany mobilized is that he doesn't care about economics. Now, that seems counterintuitive, but Hitler has such control over Germany and is able to do what he wants with the German economy that he can just sort of say things and make them happen. He's not super worried about consumer products. Even more so, Stalin is not concerned with consumer products, although that's different. But so Hitler can just get things going. The British and French are still trying to do things in a market-based economy, and they struggle to do this. They haven't yet realized they're going to have to go back into modes that they were in the First World War. Now, the other thing that's going on is there's very competing theories about how the war is going to be fought. You have these sort of, are we going to have another set of trench warfare, or are we going to have new offensive warfare? And people don't really know how to use the technologies that are available to them. And there's also this debate about how we should weight the military expenditure between land, air, and sea. For the Germans, it's a very easy decision. They don't have to worry about naval power to the same extent that the British do. The book I'm reading by this guy Paul Kennedy is called Victory at Sea, and it's about specifically the naval war during the Second World War. Britain is, in 1939, the most powerful navy in the world. America is just slightly below it. Slightly below America is Japan, and then you have the next three powers are France and Italy, and then Germany's sixth. The USSR has no significant naval power. And battleships, because they're still using battleships, soak up a huge amount of expenditure. You don't, and so this is that's a major consideration too. Now, going back to Poland, what we see is that an offensive theory is going to it's going to work, and it's going to be particularly mechanized. Now, there's a lot of propaganda that goes on with the Second World War and the representations that you see. One of the things that you'll see is photos of German divisions going in Panzer IIs, Panzer IIIs, Panzer IVs. What you don't very often see is, as I mentioned last time, the use of P-38s, because they're not iconic German tanks, because they're Czechoslovakian tanks that the Germans have repurposed. A huge amount of the German invasion of Poland is still done with horses. And on the flip side, you hear things about the Poles making cavalry charges, that sort of thing. That's quite a lot of propaganda, and sort of making the Germans look good and sound good, making the Poles look stupid. what all those jokes that Americans hear about Poles. One of the reasons, the reason that they're quite dark, right? Because the Poles are quote air quotes stupid, because between Hitler and Stalin, their great minds were all liquidated. So the Poles really experienced a lot of brutality. As you can see there, the sort of on the map of the invasion of Poland, that there's that sort of encirclement out to the west, out to the east. That's more or less the line of the partition of Poland. A number of Poles get out at the bottom through Romania, and they make their way through Turkey and I believe Iran, and then out to Britain, and where they become the basis of the Free Polish Forces, the Polish government in London, because Stalin sets up his own competing Polish force. Now, just to say one thing really quickly.
Do you happen to have an example of one of these Polish jokes? I just haven't heard any of them, so.
There's a lot that are very similar to, that are like identical to the jokes you hear about the Irish in England, except the big difference is that the Irish have always been stupid, and the Poles have only been, are unfairly made fun. The Irish are actually stupid. That's a joke. That's it.
Okay.
I can't remember any Polish jokes. I just remember them being a thing. And here's another little bit of propaganda though, the concept of blitzkrieg. So the tank is developed, and the idea behind the tank is it will be a slow moving, unit that can overcome machine gun pits. The First World War establishes the machine gun as the premier infantry weapon. Well, you now need something to beat that, and they develop tanks, and the machine guns can't do anything about the tanks. And one of the big things that happens in the Second World War is the realization that, no, tanks are not there to support infantry. Actually, infantry should be there to support tanks. And rather than having tanks dotted throughout infantry units, tanks should be collected and used en masse. Now, we like to sit here and we go, oh, the myth of German exceptionalism. These brilliant Germans, they were great. Don't get me wrong. I'm not knocking the Germans completely. But the way the Germans develop that idea is they go and look at a unit. The German military attaché in London goes to Salisbury Plain, and he watches the British Army conduct combat experiments, war games. And there's this unit called the Experimental Tank Brigade, something like that, or the Experimental Tank Battalion. And they're just playing with how to use tanks. And the Germans see what the British are doing, and they adopt it. So actually, the British invent the doctrine of blitzkrieg, more or less. I want to say one other thing before really getting going, just on the sort of these grand things. Really, what the Germans excel at is the tactics and the tactical employment of their weapons. They make excellent weapons, and they're able to use them well in a tactical situation. The Germans, largely because of the interference of the Nazi politicians, the Wehrmacht and the Kriegsmarine, and to a lesser extent the Luftwaffe, but I mean them too, they're always dealing with Hitler and trying to combat Hitler or Goering, in the case of the Luftwaffe. And Goering and Hitler are not terribly good at implementing strategy. Now, there's sort of some debate about how good Hitler was at strategy, Well, even if he was good at strategy, there was a problem insofar as he and the general staff of the Wehrmacht disagreed about strategy, and we'll talk about that in Operation Barbarossa. Um, so what happens is the the Germans take Poland. 2 weeks later, a week or two after the invasion, the Russians move in and take that eastern third. Um, and you can see that, again, that picture of Panzer twos, and then nothing happens for like 9 months. From September into the summer of 1940, there's not a lot going on. I will. There's one other thing I want to say. I'll say it later. Um, this is. I think that must be a French soldier by the shape of his helmet there. Um, I just like that as a picture. Um, the uh, the the ship there is the Admiral Graf Spee, which was a German commerce raider. It was what was called a pocket battleship. One of the things that happens in the interwar period is the Washington Naval Treaty, where they agree two things. One, they agree to overall tonnage in the classes of ships. There are 4 or 5 classes. You have battleships, aircraft carriers, heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and destroyers. They do eventually come up with total limits on each of the classes, but initially they're concerned with battleships in particular, and also and aircraft carriers. They then work their way in subsequent treaties or modifications of the treaty on cruisers and heavy cruisers. Did my PC freeze? Can you hear me? Hello? 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 Okay, Jeff can't hear me. Okay, I'm gonna keep going. Well, Jeff gets his. Um, sorry about that. They come up with these limits, and what the Germans do, and then they come up with overall limits, and they come up with limits on each particular ship. So the Germans, and then they say, like, they all agree, like, well, the British, because they're the British and they have these this large empire, well, they can have more ships or more tonnage given to them than can, the Italians. I have it here somewhere. Let's have a look. So, where is this? I'll find. It's useful to know. It's a very significant treaty. 1922. Oh well, I can't find it. That's frustrating. So there's limits on how big a battleship they can build. The Germans get around this by building the Graf Spee and things like it, which are not actually battleships. They're called pocket battleships. and they're designed to raid the enemy's merchant vessels. One of the things they realize in the First World War is that particularly Britain is very dependent upon its merchant navy. So they're going to try and raid it and inflict as much damage as they can that way, rather than trying to build a fleet that will be able to go toe to toe with the British. Partly because they've been denied the opportunity by this treaty, and also because Hitler wants to focus on things other than the Navy. Hitler is said to have said that he was a hero on land and a coward at sea. He didn't really like risking the battleships. And one of the things that happens in the Phony War, one of the first significant naval engagements, the Germans get two significant propaganda victories. They sink a passenger ship. I think they do evacuate it. It was sort of a bit of chivalry still, but they also infiltrate the Royal Naval Base at Scapa Flow and sink an old, fairly obsolete battleship, and then get out again. And it's more of a propaganda victory because of the daring of this U-boat captain going in and then undetected and getting out undetected. Graf Spee is the first real fight. The British create some hunter groups to hunt down the Graf Spee, and they sort of bottle it up. They inflict some heavy damage on it, and it limps into Montevideo in Paraguay. Was it Uruguay? I can never remember. I think it's Paraguay. I don't know. Montevideo, the one sort of next door to Buenos Aires. And they scuttle it. That's a significant sort of event that happens. One of the things that really though is happening in this Phony War is the British and French going, oh shit, we got to get our production up, and they really crank up production of, in particular, aircraft. Battleships take about 5 years to build from beginning to end, and in about 1936, I think it's 1936 when the treaty comes to an end, and everybody starts building, especially the British. The British start building ships, and but the big thing that picks up is aircraft production. The Germans are not doing amazing. There's at the beginning of the war, the Germans are producing 247 tanks a month. The British are producing 314. We don't often hear about how the British excelled. We very often hear about how the British sort of muddled through and got along. I'm going to talk about that. I hadn't prepared anything on that, but I've realized I'm going to talk about that when in a little bit with the bit about Germany. The production is remarkable though. The Second World War, in 1944, Quigley says Germany, in sort of 1943-44, Germany's war production as a percent of its economy is still only at 33%. The U.S. hits about 40%, and the U.K. hits 45%. Why does the UK hit 45%? Because they realize they put energy into something called operational research, which is widespread, and basically it's managerialism. They really develop managerialism as a science, because they realize, how are you going to beat a larger enemy? You need to be better coordinated. And what's that quote that Academic Agent likes? That, the 10 that are united will beat the 100 that are not united. Is something like that. That is very much the attitude the British have. We are going to have to go toe to toe with this entity that has monster industrial capacities. We've got a lot of map, but that lot of map is a drain in many ways for the British. They're never really able to invest in the battleship navy that they ought to have. They always have to be investing in light cruisers because they need to maintain a global presence. And light cruisers are the ideal ship for that role. So the British could have had a lot more battleships had it not been for the fact that they had to make sure that from the Falklands to Singapore, they were everywhere. They never really controlled the Pacific. Um, and
So
just
what are some of the innovations that come out of this operational research?
okay, we'll talk about that when we get to strategic bombing.
Okay.
Um, but just to give you, but well, some of the things that come out of that, just on the positive side, there's sort of a positive and negative. What can we do to better? What can we do to hurt them the most? And that's very much like the two sides of the coins of operational research. The British, the Germans peak out at about in 1944. I think it's 40,000 aircraft produced. Um, the the American or the British are at um, it's like the British are at 30, I think it is, but the Americans, when you start to look at the numbers involved in American production, it is it's scary. The Americans are able to produce in 1945 or 1944 96,000 planes for the war. Um, they it's so big. It's such an insane number. Uh, and the ability that they're able to produce in terms of putting ships into the ocean is insane. Um, the idea that the Soviets could have done anything to America is ludicrous. America, I am 100% convinced that America could have kicked the life out of the Soviet Union based simply on its aircraft production. Um, the Soviets would have had at the I watched an interview once with a German pilot, and he said that, and Quigley kind of agrees with this. Um, when asked who had the best pilots, he said, "Well, the British had the best pilots because they had the most similar education to the Germans. They understood math and sort of intuitively understood physics. They understood the concept of leading a target. The Americans were good, but they tended to go sort of straight in. They didn't think. They were just old guts. And the Soviets were mass produced. Their pilots were terrible. They fought in a two-dimensional space. They didn't use that third dimension of height that you can use in pilots. So you now take Patton wanted to co-opt the Wehrmacht into invading the USSR. Had we just given the Germans a bunch of Shermans and, given the pilots, some P-38s and P-51s, we would have hammered the Soviet Union to death. And it's one of the reasons why the Anthony Sutton stuff is so plausible to me, because if this existential threat of communism, well, actually, when you look at the production, it could have been easily dealt with. The Russians got a huge amount in Lend-Lease. The Russians do a very good job, going back to propaganda and pictures. The Russians do a very good job at making sure that as few pictures get out as possible of any equipment that isn't Russian. But there were a lot of American tanks. There were a lot of British tanks. There were British Matildas at the siege of Leningrad. nobody talks about that, right? Uh, so what where Germany fails in this period when the British are sort of kicking it up, um, it doesn't work on central planning. It doesn't develop a counterpart to operational research. Um, to give you an example, what was Germany good at? It was in terms of where was it really hurting the British with U-boats? It should have built U-boats. It should have invested in the Type 8s and the Type 21s. Uh, it never properly invests in them. And the other thing is Hitler's always changing his mind. Hitler falls in love with super weapons, um, and rather than, it would have been better if the Germans had built a lot of um, uh, Panther tanks, the Panzer fives, instead of building Tigers and King Tigers. It would have been better if they just built more um, propeller planes instead of trying to develop jets. It would have been better if they tried to build, just a lot of U-boats instead of a lot of good U-boats instead of a few super weapons, because the super weapons never materialize. They never make it to the front line. Um, the so and the other thing that's happening is Germany's struggling with supplies. So they're struggling to really get their manufacturing online, but also they've artificially hampered their manufacturing. One of the things that Hitler wants to do is this is very much about blood and soil. It's about the German people and giving them somewhere to live. And the one thing he doesn't want to do is have the German people feel the effects of the war, especially the German people at home. It's only in 1943 and 1944 when domestic servants start getting called up. If you're a domestic servant in Germany, Hitler wants the German upper classes to be and upper middle classes to be comfortable. So he doesn't eat into these areas he could have eaten into. The British from day one, especially once Churchill gets in 1940, the British know this is an existential fight. They are going to win or die trying. Now, one of the things that happens is there's this half-hearted effort on the part of the British and French and also the Germans to fight in this period, because they don't really want to. What they want is really to figure out a way to make peace, and we can see that in this slide. What happens is Stalin goes into Finland, and it quickly says it's actually a real possibility that the British and French don't fight the Germans and instead sort of pretend that war is yeah, we're totally at war with Germany over Poland, but Britain in particular really wants to fight the Soviets. If you think back to that three block theory that the British had in the interwar period of using fascist Europe to fight communist Europe and supporting fascist Europe in the fight against communist Europe, they see the invasion of Finland. They try to negotiate an agreement with Sweden to let them move troops through Sweden to Finland to fight the USSR while they're at war with Germany. That's on the map on the right. That doesn't happen. The Germans show up and help the Finns. The Finns remember that. The Finns kill a lot of Soviets in the winter, but by the late winter of early 1940, they just can't hold out against the numbers that Stalin's throwing at them. They fall back. They give to Stalin some strategic places, and that sort of ends. And then, so then now the British and French don't really have anything that they can use against the Soviets, so they're back to just fighting. The Germans, And things really heat up when Hitler goes into Denmark and Norway. Uh, then there's a sort of like failed effort to see off um, the Germans. The Norwegians do a really good job. I don't think I put it in here actually. They they uh, they do a lot of damage to the German Navy, in particular the Kriegsmarine. Um, the British pull out the Norwegians, as many Norwegians as they can. They pull out the royal family, and to this day, as a thanks for the British support in the Second World War, the tree that gets lit up in Trafalgar Square in London is a Norwegian pine, um, or fir tree, whatever they give, but they give it to the city of London as a way of um, thanking the British for that. Uh, now, Chamberlain gets ousted because of the Norway debacle, and Churchill moves in. And Churchill lets it be known that, like, no, there is no, this is do or die. The other guy that was in the running was Lord Halifax, and it's thought Lord Halifax would have made peace, um, but we get Churchill. So now Germany attacks. You can see more or less this is how the strength of the Western Front. The Netherlands hopes to be left out, like it was left out in the First World War. Belgium pretty much knows what's coming, but they insist on not allowing any French or British troops into Belgium, um, because they want to maintain neutrality. Um, the Germans never really make much effort down south because of the Maginot Line, although they do, and where they do go, try to go up against the Maginot Line, they get. The Maginot Line actually works. That's what that picture's there on the right. The Maginot Line is this really extensive border forts that are built along. You can see there on the map from the border of Switzerland to the border of Belgium. The the French do not extend that line through Belgium for two reasons. One, there's something called the Ardennes Forest, and it's thought that the Germans are not going to be able to get their tanks through the Ardennes Forest. The other thing is that it's thought that it would be a provocation against the Belgian government if the French build forts along their lines. And it would sort of be like saying, I mean, obviously Belgium's not going to invade France, but it would be sort of saying we have no confidence in you as either A, maintain your neutrality, or B, putting up any sort of resistance if the Germans go through. Then the Germans go through anyway. They go through Holland. There's some forts in Holland that are supposed to be impenetrable, and German paratroopers take very easily. They go through. They develop this sort of spearheading through the forest of the Ardennes by um, cutting down trees, and they get through the Ardennes very surprisingly, and they pop out down there by Sedan. You can see there, and start causing all sorts of havoc. And the majority of the French army, the bit down there, the 43 divisions in that second army group, they threaten to cut those two army groups off from one another. People start falling back on Paris, towards Paris, in order to try and keep the armies together. One of the things you don't want is to get your armies split up like that. The British get bottled up in that bit near Dunkirk. They get evacuated. It's a remarkable operation. Lots and lots of far more people than are thought. Far more men are gotten out than was thought to, than they thought they were going to get out. And actually, there's a theory that the Dunkirk evacuation was the best thing that could have happened to the British, because they leave behind all of their obsolete interwar period equipment, and the British industrial capacity has to now start making replacement equipment, but it's replacement equipment that is up to date. So the British then go into other operations with up to date equipment. They get out a lot of French. There is one bright spot in this, in the fall of France. There's one general. I think he's a brigadier general. He fights like the devil. He leads an armored cavalry division, tank division, and that's General de Gaulle. So General de Gaulle escapes to escapes to Britain eventually, and he has this legend of like the fighting Frenchman. When all the other like French leaders were giving up, de Gaulle was fighting. Um, de Gaulle, I love. I love de Gaulle. I find him very frustrating since I'm British and he's French. So, well, since I'm English and he's French. I just wish de Gaulle had been English. But the more I learn about de Gaulle, the more I like him. The more I think that he had the right vision for the post-war. Um, one of the things that happens is the Churchill offers a political union with France to keep the French fighting. There would be a single country, the empires would be united, and it would be this way of showing we're not giving up on half of the country. I don't know that it's ever really developed as an idea. The French, I don't think, take it seriously, but it's an interesting what if. Marshal Pétain, the First World War French general, is in Spain. He's the French ambassador to Spain because he's right wing, and it's thought that he'd be a good guy to have talking to Franco, who's just won the Spanish Civil War. He gets called back in the hopes of leading some government, and he and France falls, and Vichy France forms around him. I don't have a picture in here of Vichy France, the map of what it looked like, but basically the entire Atlantic coast, if you wrap around down from Dunkirk down to the Spanish border, all of that was administered by Germany, whereas this sort of the bit inside there, alongside Switzerland and the border with Italy, down to the Mediterranean, that's run by Vichy France. Pétain has four goals when he comes in. He's not interested in fighting a war. He just wants four things. He wants the independence of unoccupied France. He wants the release of all the French prisoners that Germany's taken. He wants to reduce the cost of occupations. The Germans are charging the French for their occupation. And he wants to reduce the barriers between occupied and unoccupied France. A lot of, just on point two, a lot of French guys go and work in Germany in factories. There's a rather well-known French author, Robespierre. He goes to Germany. He's too young to fight. He goes to Germany though, and he calls it like a holiday. The Germans put on like these cultural things for the French workers to make them pro German, and he would go to Wagner, and he would, he said he had a lovely time for the most part. The Germans very much sort of play up and try to sell anti-Englishness to the French, and the French are very willing to buy into that. And so now we've got a situation where from Norway to Gibraltar, Britain is faced by a coastline of Nazi or fascist Europe. This is the dark time for Britain. From the summer of 1940 onwards, it's very dark. One of the things that the British are very, very concerned with is the French fleet in North Africa. The French have orders to scuttle the ships if the Germans try to take them. The British are not, however, satisfied with this. And they give an ultimatum. They say, come over or we're going to sink you. The French, these are French navy that's loyal to Vichy France, not not to De Gaulle. I don't know that De Gaulle is even really the leader of the Free French at this point. Um, and they destroy the French fleet. They don't take any chances. It's also to say Mussolini jumps in on the southern border of France, in the Alps, the French Alps. Doesn't do well, but Hitler still gives him some territory, um, and holds him off. There is a glimmer of hope for the British, though, and that's the Battle of Britain. That picture in the right, the bottom right. Churchill comes and he gives the British some iron, and the in order to set up an invasion of Britain, it's acknowledged that the Germans first need to establish air superiority, and Churchill realizes like this is our moment. This has got to be when we make our stand, and it's September of 1940, and everything is on the roll of the dice, and the British win, and it really is sort of their finest hour. Quigley says that there's 6 reasons why the British win, and it's an important victory because it's the first significant defeat of Hitler. The one, he says, the indomitable spirit of the British people. They really kind of discover, after the First World War, it might be sort of thought, well, do we have another fight left in us? Do we really have the desire to really slog it out in a European war? And I think the Battle of Britain has the significance of Trafalgar. That, you know what, we really can do this. We really can go toe to toe and beat them. The British planes were better, Quigley says, and I'm going to be getting to this in a minute. So, where is it? Or have I skipped it already? But yeah, Quigley says the British have better planes. They have more planes. The pilots are better. Very importantly here for what we're going to talk about in the next episode. I think Quigley talks more about operational research in the next episode. That are sort of are the command and control from the development of operational research was far superior. We were fighting over home territory, and the British scientific advances in the form of radar were developed, so the British could see the German planes coming. And yeah, so I want to talk about two things that Quigley doesn't talk about because he's too close to them, and one is, and they're very closely related, and I think Quigley does sort of reveal it here. One is the myth of German superiority. There's this idea that every piece of German equipment was amazing, and the German soldier was some sort of super soldier. This impression is easy to form when you look at what happens on the Eastern Front, where you have, essentially malnourished peasants being thrown into a meat grinder by Stalin with insufficient equipment versus fairly, well-trained, well-led. Stalin liquidated his general staff in the 30s. The Germans are well-led. They have an excellent non-commissioned officer system. The Germans, one of the things, the success of the Germans actually has less to do with tanks than people think. It has more to do with the way that their infantry squads operated around the MG32 or 34, whichever one it is, and their sergeants sort of directing them. The Germans do really well there. But when the Germans have to face British, the British are able to go toe-to-toe with them. They're not defeated in these routes. So I think there's two things that go on in the creation of this myth. One is the view of what happens in against the Soviets. The other thing is I genuinely think that the myth is propagated by German Americans who look at the war and they want to see some redeeming qualities in the Germans because they might be embarrassed about the politics. Well, at least they were bad politics, but they fought like lions. Well, they didn't fight any better really than the French or the British. The French had a problem in terms of their leadership. The Poles had a problem in terms of their equipment. But when you put the Poles and the French in Britain, gave them British equipment, and they knew that those guys that had gotten to Britain knew they had Churchill behind them, those guys fought like hell too. So I think that the quality of the Germans is overstated. Similarly, I think that the quality of the British in particular is significantly understated. We had the finest navy in the world. It was not just like a bunch of big things left over. Where we were deficient in the terms of the navy was in our aircraft carriers. This is what Paul Kennedy says. Our tanks were very good. There's this myth of like the British tanks being bad. They were very good in comparison to what the Americans were producing. The French tanks were excellent. The problem was we couldn't get them out. One of the things that happens is when Germany invades Russia, they're using a lot of French equipment that they capture in the fall of France. And I think the other thing that happens is it's not just German Americans, it's Americans in general, because what they want to propagate is this idea that the British were barely holding on and weren't doing a very good job at it anyway. It's true that the British were incredibly under pressure, but what the British were able to accomplish from 1939 to 1941 to the winter to basically 1942 is remarkable. They held on for 2 years and a bit. They had the support of American production, and that cannot be understated. But they also innovated in ways that was remarkable. Lots and lots of the stuff that America made was off of the backs of British innovation, and this continues up into including the atomic bombs. And there's a fair bit of betrayal that happens around the atomic bombs too. At this point, the night bombing emerges on both sides because the Luftwaffe is eliminated as a strategic operator. It's now really only able to operate tactically on the Eastern Front, and only kind of strategically at night against Britain. Night flights happen. The British respond. And the development of precision bombing occurs, especially on the British side. Now, what precision bombing here means is not obviously smart missiles level targeting. What the precision refers to is the ability to triangulate your position in flight from two radio stations in Britain. So you can figure out mathematically where over Germany you are, down to a couple of 100 meters, which was precise by the time of that that age. And when you very often hear them referred to sort of pejoratively of, well, they couldn't hit a football field if they wanted to. Yeah, great. But by the standards of the time, what the British were able to achieve in terms of their strategic bombing and their location was quite remarkable. When the Americans enter, they start out in daylight bombings because they think that it's going to be more accurate. There isn't really any evidence that backs that up, and they eventually transition to nighttime bombing. But I also think it's important here, as it's going to come up in a little bit, to acknowledge there's some pretty the bombing of Germany is probably the most shameful aspect of the Western Allies' conduct because of the number of civilians that they kill pretty intentionally. Now, there's an important thing here. Mussolini intervenes in Yugoslavia and Greece. He has this little thing in the 30s with Albania. He takes it, but in 41, he goes into Yugoslavia and Greece, and he also starts this like push across the desert in 1940. I think it's 1940. He is the first sort of push eastwards. That map shows there's a sort of yo-yo back and forth that happens in the desert. That goes on for 3 years. I think it's 1942 that the Axis is kicked out of North Africa. But Yugoslavia and Greece are really important because Mussolini goes in and he almost gets pushed out of Albania by the Greeks. And I think the Greeks counterattack into Yugoslavia too. It's a disaster. The Italians never really perform satisfactorily. They're poorly led. There's a stupid restructuring of the Italian army whereby a division gets resized from 3 regiments to 2 regiments in order to make the Italian army look bigger on paper, which means that when you throw a division into the field, it sounds good, but it is 1/3 weaker than the British divisions it's fighting. The Italians have very good equipment, but they're never able to use it because they have to sell it, because Mussolini economically kind of like ruins the Italian economy, and they're always selling their best equipment to places like Spain and Portugal, and so the Italians don't do well. Hitler sees this and he goes, well, I can't let this fall apart in the Balkans. The British are very, very interested in maintaining the Balkans because they see that as somewhere that the Soviets are going to try and go into. They really want to keep themselves a presence in the Balkans. They want everyone in the Balkans to think of them as friends. So Mussolini pushes in. There's a disaster. It's at this time that the British destroy the French fleet. Italy attacks Greece. And he doesn't tell Hitler that he's going to do this because Hitler has so often, time and again, gone to Mussolini and gone, this is how it is, you're going to go with it. Mussolini wants to be able to do the same thing to Hitler. There's the British attack on the fleet in Taranto. They send in some torpedo bombers and blow up a good deal of the Italian fleet. The Japanese see this and very much model Pearl Harbor after this. And Germany has to intervene. And what intervening means is delaying plans for the invasion of Russia. A lot of equipment and a lot of men and a lot of time go into this push through Yugoslavia and Greece and the invasion of Crete. And it delays the invasion of Russia significantly. Which means that when the invasion starts, it's weeks later than was meant to be. And one of the significant things is the winter is just setting in, and the Germans can see the spires of St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow, and the roofs of the Kremlin, but they're never able to quite take it. And had the Germans taken Moscow, Russia probably would have fallen apart at that point. But one of the things that happens on the West is Spain sees this debacle. Franco was promising that he was going to get involved, but he sees this and he goes, you know what, I'm out. So the invasion of Gibraltar falls apart, and that then weakens the axis in the Mediterranean. There's a big battle over the island of Malta. The Italians and Germans really want to bomb Malta into submission. It nearly starves, but they get enough. The British are constantly pouring material into supporting Malta, and the Maltese are very loyal. The British only lose Malta in the post-war period out of retardation on the part of the Labour Party, but that's a story for another day. The Maltese vote in a referendum in the 50s. They want to become part of Britain. They want to have MPs in the Houses of Parliament. Hitler then kind of reframes the war for anyone that he can get in as we're gonna pick apart the British Empire. He says to USSR, he says it to Italy, he says it's to Vichy France, Japan. Let's all just jump on the British and we're gonna divide the carcass. That doesn't really work. The Russians aren't interested. The Japanese are already planning. The Italians, it doesn't matter if they're on side or not. There's a school of thought that says if Mussolini had stayed neutral, Germany might have won the war. That actually it actively hurt the Axis by having the Italians on side. Now
That bad, eh?
yeah, it's because it's a lot of troops that have to go into the Balkans. I don't know the numbers, but yeah. Now in this period, 1939 to 1942, American production is really picking up. Roosevelt gives us this number. I already told you in 1944, the number that's given is they make 96,000 planes, and that's in other sources too. This is not Quigley finding some number. Like, it's 96,000 planes, and those are fighters, those are bombers. You see their tanks, and up on the right, those are Liberty ships, which were the merchant vessels that were made to get stuff across the Atlantic. In September 1940, I'm just going to read. In September 1943, the United States launched 155 ships, 1.7 million tons, and was in a position to continue at this rate of 5 ships a day, or at 19 million tons indefinitely. That's a lot. In September 1941, when the German U-boats were aiming to sink 700,000 tons a month, the United States only completed 7 of these Liberty ships, 64,000 tons. But it was by 1943, sorry, they were producing 20 times that. So the German ability to sink, their goal of how much shipping they wanted to sink was not even half of what America was able to ramp its production up to. America was just flooding stuff eastwards. Now, I can go on and on and on about the amount that they produced. It's just a lot, and it's practically more than everybody else combined. And the really bitter thing about this is the way that America behaves in regards to Britain, which is supposed to be its ally. The Americans institute the Neutrality Act, And the Neutrality Act basically says, like, well, we're not going to sell arms to people, but they variously modify it, and they can sell arms to people that are considered like the good guys. And so they keep selling to Britain, and there's this very much this faction between the pro-British and the isolationists in America. The Democrats are fairly pro-British. The Republicans are fairly isolationist. But anyway, regardless, the propping up of the British really kicks their production line into gear. Where the bitterness comes in is the price that the Americans extracted from the British for this. The deal that they insisted on was the British were not going to get any credit until the British had liquidated all of their overseas assets and all of their gold and used that up first. That has never been done. And the Americans very much use this war as a way of destroying the British as a global power. The British come out of it with debts that they're paying off even today, and they're forced to basically end the British imperial system. They're forced to end what's called the Sterling Zone. America supports insurgencies in the colonies, in Africa, things like that. And America says one of the things we're not going to do is we're not going to liberate territory that is part of the British and French Empire just because it's part of the British and French Empire. The only reason we're going to go do that is if it's a strategic purpose. And even then, we're not interested in doing it for those reasons. So there are times when you have there's some amazingly anti-British guys in the military, in the American military. And there are times when they're operating alongside British forces, particularly in the Pacific, and they are just the British can't work with them. As an example, one of the agreements that is finally pushed on the Americans was that when an area surrendered, if it was part of the British or French Empire, it would be returned to the British or French Empire. There's a difference between that and the Americans fighting during the war to liberate it. And the Americans, and when the Americans dropped the bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, they've yet to get to Hong Kong. And Hong Kong is occupied by the Japanese. And it's an American task force that shows up first. Now, what the American task force is supposed to do is hold the territory until the former colonial, the former empire can show up and take it. The captain of this task force ignores this, and he goes, "I'm going to give it to Chiang," and he says this. He makes this declaration that he's going to hand over Hong Kong to Chiang Kai-shek, and that Chiang Kai-shek should come down to Hong Kong and get it. The British hear about this and throw up a hell of a mess with Truman. Truman then has to make this task force leader back down and say he's going to give it to the British, and the British show up and take it from him. But Hong Kong nearly gets lost, 50 years early because of the Americans. They're very much not the British allies. The British are their allies. The Americans are not the British allies. So there's a lot.
Lord Conzilla says least surprising anime betrayal in history, maybe ever.
Right. Well, we know. Yeah. I
I'm wondering though, where does this come from though? What is the motivation behind it?
Well, the motivation is that America was established in 1776 by a bunch of Masonic deists, and they are Anglos that have been weaponized to destroy the Anglo homeland. That's what I think. I think that from day one, the intent of the American Republic was to destroy the British Empire. Uh, I can't unequivocally prove that, but that's a Bucklander tinfoil hat thing. I think they were always meant to destroy um, Britain as a significant force. I mean, do you think that's
I guess
crazy?
they saw an opportunity there, you know,
Well, one of the things,
to become the world hegemony.
yeah, it's very frustrating. I got some notes on this in a little bit about that. It's very frustrating for the British to deal with them. The British are trying to keep them like adults in the way that Americans are thinking about the post-war. I'll talk about that in a minute. Um, the But yeah, they use the system. I mean, and one of the things I'd like to do a little one-off episode on is the structure of the Bretton Woods Agreement and how that was designed to destroy the British Empire. There's a book called The Battle of Bretton Woods, which I'd quite like to cover. But that's a bit more. I think there's actually an application there for what we're talking about. But yeah, I gotta keep moving. I gotta keep moving because I see we're already quite a ways in. Operation Barbarossa happens. I know what you're thinking. We're still only in 1941. Things do speed up a little bit here in the narrative that quickly gives us. Um, Hitler very much is pushing on that. He wants to take Leningrad and he wants to take Stalingrad. He's not bothered about Moscow. And you see there are those three arrows pushing across Russia. Um, the generals in the Wehrmacht want to take Moscow. Hitler wants to take Leningrad and Stalingrad. It's thought because of the names that are attached to them, the symbolic victory. The generals think if we take Moscow, we'll cut Russia in half. A lot of very important north-south rail links go through Moscow, and we'll be able to control it. They don't push far enough on any of those three. All three hold out. And the thought is, again, well, if one or the other had been able to focus their strategic intent, they would have taken it. Right. There's not a lot that's said about the war on the Eastern Front by Quigley. Huge numbers die. 9 out of 10 Germans that die in the war are killed on the Eastern Front. But for every German that's killed, they kill 13 or 14 Russians. It's really a significant death toll. But in terms of strategy and in terms of innovation, and in terms of the story of tragedy and hope, it is just this like two behemoths pushing at each other. There isn't a lot of really interesting things that go on for the sake of this story. Now, Japan. Japan finds itself bogged down in China. It's cut off from American supplies. The Americans cut off oil supplies to Japan, I think, in 1938. There's an oil embargo. They've got to do something. They've got to secure supplies, particularly oil supplies. Where do you go for oil supplies in Asia? Well, you go to Indonesia. And Indonesia is controlled by the Dutch. There's this government in exile. The Dutch East Indies are supporting the government that's relocated to London. They look at the map and they go, well, if we go for the Dutch East Indies, we might as well also take out the British in Singapore and Malaysia. And if we do that, we are guessing that the Americans are going to come in on their side. So we might as well attack the Americans now. Now, I think that more or less the Americans declared war on Japan with the oil embargo, and they ought to have known that the Japanese were going to do something. In the Russia-Japanese War of 1901, is it 1901-02? The Japanese launched a surprise torpedo attack on the Russian Pacific Fleet in Port Arthur. They have a bunch of destroyers come up and launch torpedoes and get out. And there's a Japanese admiral or captain who was captured by the Americans. Somebody and the Americans asked him like why he did it, why they decided to do it, and he went, "Don't you know our history? Don't you know like we have to do things like this, or else, you know, we lose. We're small. We have to maintain initiative. We have to do things like that, or else we have no hope." And of course, within that is the belief that more or less the Americans have declared war on us by denying us access to oil. Um, there isn't a lot of room for ethics in these considerations, right? You can the ethics and morality of these sorts of grand strategic struggles are all well and good done in hindsight. This is brute force, realpolitik. We need oil. The Americans have taken away from it. Either we give in to America and wither away, or we do something about it and try to maintain our status as a great power. I am going to say something controversial here. I quite respect Japan for. Oh, I realize I called it Pearly Harbor there. Hold on. I respect Japan for this. I respect Japan for fighting and for doing something so daring. They do the same thing to the British, and I could resent the Japanese. I don't. I still resent the Americans more, even though technically the Japanese are the ones that formally end British naval supremacy. They attack Singapore and the East Asia Squadron, and destroy. I think it's the Prince of Wales, which in just a little fact, the Prince of Wales was sitting on the bottom of the South China Sea for some time, and they went to go look at it a few months ago and discovered it was gone because the PRC, People's Republic of China, had gone with submarines and salvaged all the steel that the Prince of Wales was made out of, because it was from an era before the atomic bombs were exploded. And vintage steel is actually very valuable because it's useful for physics experiments because it's not contaminated by these atoms of unique material that don't exist in the world prior to 1945, prior to the bomb, the detonation of the bomb at Los Alamos. And pretty much once that bomb explodes, these atoms go throughout the atmosphere. Anyway, that's just a little interesting bit of trivia. The Japanese destroy the British squadrons, and with that, the Americans now have a larger fleet, and the Americans are now able to outproduce anything that the British can. So the British lose their position as number one. Now, the other thing that happens here very significantly is the big gun battleships are all in harbor. The aircraft carriers are all out of harbor. The Japanese destroying the battleships and significantly wounding the battleships at Pearl Harbor mean that the Americans need to pivot to an aircraft carrier based strategy. This is actually a blessing in disguise, because what we're going to discover in the net course of the rest of the war is that battleships have become obsolete without anybody realizing it, and aircraft carriers are the future of war. Just to go look here, this is the way the Japanese expand throughout Asia. Interesting little note: Vietnam. The French make an agreement. The Vichy French make an agreement with the Japanese that the Japanese can go through Vietnam, into Thailand and into Malaysia. They take Singapore. They go into Burma. One of the things I was going to say is this is one of the reasons to also, or I think a number of British and French people are bitter about America in general, is like America treats it as like the war started on December 7th, 1941. The war started in September 1939, and America showed up for the second half. It sort of like marginalizes the efforts of the French and British up to that point. And another place that the British are really marginalized is in the war against the Japanese. The British contribute an enormous amount to the fight against the Japanese, and more Japanese are tied down in the Burma theater than they are anywhere else. I think in terms of like Japanese army, the British kill more Japanese army servicemen than the Americans do, because the Americans are island hopping from island to island, and they're never actually like dealing with very many guys at a time. Those islands are very bloody, but the British in fight in Burma is huge, and it's the longest running land campaign in the war. No other land campaign lasts as long as Burma does. So again, the British are really undervalued. They take a lot of they take Indonesia, and they almost take the island of New Guinea, but the Australians start pumping men up there. They're joined eventually by U.S. Marines and Army, and they push back up through New Guinea. They deny it to them, and in June 4th, 1942. So 6 months after Pearl Harbor. I don't know if you can see it there, but just sort of if you see where Pearl Harbor is on the far right of the map, just at about like 9 o'clock, in reference to that, there's a little ship. It says Battle of Midway. Battle of Midway is very important. In the course of a few days, I believe it's 5 Japanese carriers are sunk. With this, the shift is complete, whereby aircraft carriers are dominant. The Japanese are denied their aircraft carriers, and their aircraft carriers are sunk by U.S. Aircraft based off of American aircraft carriers. The Americans only lose, I think it's one aircraft carrier, the Yorktown maybe, but they're now in this position whereby they're able to control the war. They control the naval war with the aircraft carriers. Prior to this, what they're doing is everybody's using aircraft carriers as scouting units. They're not using aircraft carriers as combined combat units. And the Americans put together what are called carrier task forces of 2 or more aircraft carriers which are operating jointly. And they realize that the combined air wings of these aircraft carriers are very effective, the torpedo bombers in particular. And in November 2nd of 1942, we have the Battle of El Alamein. Oh, here we go. That pictures of the sinking of one of the Japanese aircraft carriers by an American dive bomber. The top is just I think that might be El Alamein. That is a M3 Grant tank, a weird American tank. There's a Panzer burning. I think that's a Crusader tank. This is and then at the bottom, this is a fairly well-known picture of British Tommies charging across the desert during the Second Battle of El Alamein. At the same time, 2 days later, the Americans land in North Africa, and finally there are some American troops. 11 months after Pearl Harbor, finally there are some American troops on the ground fighting the Germans. They do incredibly badly, and the British develop a nickname for the Americans where they start calling them our Italians. Incidentally, there's a fun little story about whenever the Italians heard that that the Australians had been put into the line against them, the number of Italians that would surrender went up, because they were all terrified of Australians because they thought they were all great big monsters. I've always enjoyed that story. Rommel finally he's been moved down to North Africa, finally gets defeated. He never really gets the supplies he needs. If the Germans had given more material to Rommel, if the Italians had been his Italian and allies had been better, it might have gone. It might have been a very different story, but the British are always very invested in North Africa. This goes to the British long time strategic method of trying to defeat their opponents by a death by a thousand cuts, opening up as many fronts all over the place as they can because they have the advantage in terms of maneuvering and transport with their naval power. And at this point, the invasion of Russia falls apart. And Churchill would say that uh, El Alamein was the end of the beginning. That before El Alamein, we didn't have any defeats, or we didn't have any victories, and after El Alamein, we didn't have any defeats. So El Alamein was a significant moment. It wasn't a significant moment in terms of absolute men, uh, beaten, but it was a significant strategic moment because now the Allies controlled half of the Mediterranean. Um, Now, after I don't have a slide for this really. That is a picture of the 8th Air Force bombing. And then in the bottom corner is Dresden. Operational research really kicks in. The British develop a strategy of bombing the bottlenecks in German supplies, but they never really do. They always ignore. Um, I think is it Anthony Sutton talks about this. I can't remember where this is from, but that the uh, there were orders given by to the Americans and to the British not to bomb certain facilities that were jointly owned and operated by American or British conglomerates prior to the war because there was a good chance that they were going to go back to their pre-war arrangements. There's some very fishy things that go on in terms of bombing. That they bomb factories right next door to other factories, but they don't attack the other factory when it's a more strategic factory. Um, there's some fishy things there. Where do I know? I when I think about where I know that from, um, that might be a history of central banking. Now that I think about
Okay.
it,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah. Well, that makes sense though. I mean,
there's some
other,
fishy
the
stuff. The extent to which you want to say it's fishy,
yeah,
though, yeah. Um, Now there's
certain interests have to be protected, right?
yeah. Um, okay, so there's a various set of conferences that happen. I don't have pictures for these, where uh, you know basically the Americans put out like these very idealistic visions of what the post-war world's going to look like. It very much is in contradiction to um, British and French interests, um, and the British kind of like are sitting there like, bro, what are you doing? Because and they know that Stalin has taken the piss. Churchill knows exactly what Stalin is. Although I think like Churchill in some ways probably preferred dealing with Stalin because he and Stalin were like these two old war horses who'd played this game of international politics their whole lives. FDR was a moron. He was idealistic, and he would come back from meetings with Stalin going, "I've got Stalin on my side. Uncle Joe likes me, and I like him, and I know blah blah blah." And most of the real negotiating that actually gets done with Stalin is done by Churchill. There's this famous like napkin or envelope negotiation where they never say a word, but Churchill just writes down like basically you can have Poland if you leave Greece alone in the post-war. Now this sucks, right? Because the whole point of the war starting was to liberate Poland. And at the end of the war, Poland ends up under the control of the Soviets. It sucks, but it's just the way things are. There was no way the Allies were going to be able to liberate Poland. A couple of things happen that make this inevitable because in the liberated areas of Italy, I don't have a slide on the invasion of Italy, and Italy gets invaded in 1943, and we never fully take Italy. The Germans hold us up through Italy until the fall of Berlin, um, and we make progress up there. But Italy's really bloody. They destroy a lot of ancient Christian sites. Fairly intentionally, I think. I think there's an argument to be made that if you really want to get tinfoily, I think there's an argument to be made that there's some globalist anti-Christian set of phenomena that goes on the ally side, and on both sides really, but on the ally side, that in terms of destroying Christian monuments um, and cities and things like that. Um, the and it's thought that it's not an insignificant event that the place that America drops their bomb, or at least one of their bombs, is the most Christian city in Japan, Nagasaki. Nagasaki was, I think it still is. It is a very, very Christian place. It's not insignificant. But anyway, they destroy the monastery of St. Benedict. Is Monte Cassino, is it? I think it's Monte Cassino is the one. I know they definitely destroy Monte Cassino. I'm just not sure if it's the St. Benedict one or not. Anyway, in these negotiations, the Americans are idealistic, the Russians are realistic, and Britain is realistic, but it's caught trying to stay on side of the Americans and trying to make the Americans more realistic about what's going to happen. Stalin doesn't trust Britain. He thinks that Britain has been trying to undermine him and would want to destroy him if they could, which is true. But the British are also realistic. And one of the big things that Stalin is pushing for is, throughout these conferences, he really wants a second front opened up against the Germans on the mainland of Europe. He doesn't like the British and Americans going, well, we're doing North Africa. He's also not satisfied with the invasion of Sicily or Italy. That's not what he means. He wants mainland Germany put under pressure. And it's not until 1944 that this happens. Now, why is it not until 1944 that this happens? Well, there's a majority Canadian raid on the port of Dieppe. It's a bit of a disaster. They pull back, they get out, but a lot of Canadians die. Their equipment's all left behind, and the British realize this is going to be hard. It's going to be really difficult launching an amphibious operation on that west coast. One of the things that comes out of the First World War is the realization that amphibious landings are difficult. And the British really learned this with Gallipoli. And they're not eager to do Gallipoli 2.0. So after a lot of preparation and a lot of planning, they landed at Normandy. Again, you listen to Americans and you would only think there was one or two beaches. There were 5 beaches. Omaha was the bloodiest. I think 2,000 men died at Omaha, and about 400 died at Sword and Gold, or Sword and Juno. And then Utah was fairly light, and then the other Gold or Juno was fairly light. But you can see there that map, the Americans were responsible for Utah and Omaha, and Gold, Juno, and Sword were British and Canadian. And I believe the Canadians were at Gold and Sword, and the British were at Juno. The British made significant paratrooper landings that I don't think are really reflected on that map. There's a battle for somewhere called Pegasus Bridge. So again, the narrative that you get that comes out of America is very much a sort of like, oh, America did everything. Well, where are the Canadians and the Brits? there's I realize we're coming up on nearly 2 hours. So I could go on, but I don't want to go on if it's not. Yeah. So America's controlling the strategy. There's this thing called the Combined Chiefs of Staff forms of British and American generals and admirals working together. But it's obvious that the British have to do what the Americans say because they're making everything and they're bankrolling everything. So they sort of like give into these um, demands on the parts of the American. Um, Mussolini's overthrown. Italy tries to switch sides to the Allies. The Germans go in and don't allow this. They put Mussolini back in. Mussolini is then overthrown again when he's hanged upside down with his mistress. And the precedent of what happens with Italy is the precedent gets established that whoever liberates the territory administers it. So the British and Americans administer Italy, and they don't give the Russians any sort of say over Italy. Stalin sees this and says, okay, that's fine, I'm fine with that, but I'm going to do the same thing with all the areas I liberate. Those are all mine now. So Poland goes over to Russia. Um, Churchill at this time is trying to construct something for the post-war. He's trying to construct a counterbalance to the U.S. and the USSR. He wants to form the EU, or what will become the EU, or a NATO that is only European. Doesn't really get what he's trying to do because the Americans are again too powerful. Yugoslavia kicks off. There's an insurgency there. There's a very big problem that I think is revealing of what happens in other places, which is that the conservatives are not good at resisting the Germans. Not because the conservatives are pro-German, it's because the conservatives care about the pre-war situation. The conservatives care about the people. And there's a guy named Mihailovich, and then there's Tito on the other side. And what Quigley says about Mihailovich is that Mihailovich was trying to preserve the old order. He didn't want to start an insurgency that would get peasants killed because the Germans would do punitive executions. They'd round up a few dozen guys after an attack, and they'd just kill them. And Mihailovich was royalist, and Tito wasn't. And Tito wanted to change everything. And Tito, in wanting to change everything, was prepared to let hundreds and thousands of Yugoslavians die because he didn't care. He just wanted to get the war won and have a system in which he was in control, and which was communist. So I think that, and that's reflective of a lot of things. You don't really see traditional conservative royalists coming out of the Second World War because I think they're trapped in that thing of, well, we actually care about this country and the old system, and the communist insurgents don't. And the communist insurgents don't have anything to lose, and they don't care about the cost to the old system. Uh, the then there's the Battle of the Bulge, which is quite famous, which is really like the last attempt on. I've skipped over a major operation that happened in Netherlands, Operation Market Garden, which is very interesting, but I won't talk about that. But the Battle of the Bulge happens. It's very much the last gasp of the Wehrmacht on the Western Front. After that, more or less, Germany collapses. That invasion of Germany that you see there on the West is not fought very hard. There's very much a race for Berlin because they want to divide up the country and take it and not have to give the Russians any more than they need to. There's battles that are fought on the Eastern Front where the Wehrmacht units are fighting to buy time for Germans to escape westwards and get as far away from the Soviets as possible. They know what the Soviets are going to do, and they do it. The Soviets are incredibly bloodthirsty whenever they take any German towns. Huge amounts of rape that happen. And this isn't to say that the Germans were the good guys. The Germans did terrible things too, but the Soviets and the Germans, Nazis fighting one another, were like two assholes in a knife fight, and I don't really care who wins. I have sort of become a bit more of a boomer on the narrative about the Western Allies. I've sort of come back to develop some affection for the Western Allies in recent years, but the Eastern Front, they're just both assholes. Hitler commits suicide. But they fight a long time. The Germans fight well beyond when it seems that they should surrender. There's conspiracy theories. Did Hitler get away? Did he not? There's a sort of a good series called Hunting Hitler, which is really should be like 1/4 of its length because it's they feel it was so much fluff, but it's about theories about Hitler got away. But yeah, maybe he went to South America. Who knows? The Japanese are defeated by this process of island hopping, and they get bombers in strategic range of the Japanese homeland. One of the really interesting things that happens in this period is the rise of China. And China, quickly says, doesn't deserve to like rise on its own. What happens is the Americans very much use China as a battering ram for their policies. They insist that China is a great power, that China needs to be mentioned in these documents at the level of Britain and the US and Russia, and even like above France. And I think that there's something there. We've talked a little bit about it in the past, Jeff. I'm not sure if it was on stream or not, but the China mission, the China Yale mission. I kind of think the way to think about
the Dixie missions.
Yeah, I kind of think the way to think about China is the way that what was going on with Ukraine, that it was sort of like some sort of laundering operation for American intelligence in terms of like money and information and equipment. I want to see there's something really similar between what happened with Ukraine between the end of the Cold War and what's going on now, and what happened with China. The Americans have a weird involvement with China, and I need to come to grips with it, but I haven't yet. We're nearly done.
Yeah,
right?
the OSS was heavily involved in what was happening between Mao and Chiang Kai-shek.
And it's really interesting.
So they basically picked winners and losers there.
Yeah, and they also insisted that it was going to be a great power for the sake of the global order, when it was not yet evident that China was a great power. And then you think about the way Nixon went in and propped up China, opened China up. It's a bit. There's something fishy going on there. Now, just to say really quickly, the wars are fought very differently in the Pacific and in Europe. Truman becomes president, doesn't trust Churchill. One of the things that happens is the British and Americans decide to jointly develop the atomic bomb, and the British can't put in a lot of capital, physical capital. The Americans say, well, don't worry, we got the physical capital. Excuse me. The Americans put in the electricity. The Manhattan Project sucks up a huge amount of electricity. And it's only really because the Hoover Dam was built that the Manhattan Project's able to happen. But what happens is the agreement is that when the bomb's developed, the British are going to have access to it. Well, the bomb gets developed, and Truman pulls the rug out from under the British, and he says, "No, I should say, the thing is, the bomb would almost certainly not have been developed had it not been for the British, because we send over all of our um, geniuses, and Britain has always punched above its weight in its ability to innovate and develop and produce new technologies. Um, I think like the only country that has come close to us in a global historical sense is Germany. Um, I don't think America compares really. I think America has very often built off of British innovations, but I'm talking about in a long time span view. In the last 70 years, yeah, America's innovated well. But even up into the 60s, the British were building what were considered the best fighter aircraft, the best jet aircraft. Nobody could build jets like we nobody built jets like we build jets. So the British put in all this intellectual capital, and then Truman yanks the rug out from Churchill, doesn't give him the bomb. Churchill gets voted out in 1945 in what's called the Khaki Revolution, and the British are finally done. What we were not really sure about in 1918, we're sure about in 1945, which is we're done. We're done. We've been bled dry. Um, and Stephen Ambrose, the guy who wrote the Band of Brothers book that the TV show is based off of, in an interview, he talks about what each country gained from the Second World War. And he's American. And they go, what did Britain gain from the war? And he says something quite bittersweet, which is that he says Britain gets morality out of the war. Britain is the only country that is allowed to say we stood from 1914 to 1945 against the wave of German aggression, against these revisionist powers, these genocidal powers. We're the only country that stood, and we didn't gain anything out of it. Everybody else gained things out of it, but the British Empire lost everything. And the British are the only people that are allowed to stand up and say, we did this for the right reasons. We genuinely fought because it was right. And nobody else can say that. The Americans get stuff out of it. The Soviets get stuff out of it. The British are genuinely, basically what he says, the actual good guys of the war. And it's a very bittersweet interview. It's in a remarkable series called, I think it's World at War or World in Flames, which was made in the 70s, and it's narrated by Laurence Olivier. I highly recommend it. It's a great documentary. I should note I'm not doing something spicy here. I'm not doing something Nick Fuentes here. There is no mention of the Holocaust in these chapters. I'm not sure if Quigley mentions it, but you have to remember Quigley's writing in 1963, and the sort of academic development of the Holocaust as an area of study, I don't think is quite there. I think he does. I think he does mention it in the next chapter, but there's nothing to be read into that. Quigley thinks that it happens. I guarantee you that. I don't think Quigley is saying like something spicy. So there's nothing to be read into that, and there's nothing to be read into me not mentioning it. Now, of course, the war ends with the dropping of the nuclear bombs. The left is Hiroshima, and the right is Nagasaki. They're different bombs. One's uranium and one's plutonium because of the amounts that had to be produced. They don't yet have the technology to produce enough to have the same type of bomb dropped on both. And I think about 40,000 people die in each blast. Now, the problem, the using an atomic bomb is symbolic. But more people die in the firebombing of Tokyo than in either of these blasts. And no nuclear bombs used on Tokyo. It's just incendiary bombs. But some 80,000 people die in the bombing of Tokyo. Um, the bombing of civilians on both sides accomplishes nothing, and I think it's equally reprehensible on both sides. The bombing of Dresden is the worst thing that the British have ever done that I can think of. It was unnecessary. It wasn't needed. It didn't accomplish any war goals. It just killed innocent Germans. And same with the bombing of Tokyo, and same with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What makes Hiroshima and Nagasaki so reprehensible is we know that the Japanese were ready to surrender. I don't mean we know that now. We knew that then. And Truman wanted to drop the bomb to send a message to Stalin. It was nothing to do with the Japanese. The Japanese were ready to surrender. The problem is that the Potsdam Declaration, which insisted on complete Japanese surrender, was ambiguous as to the status of the emperor. The Japanese were prepared to surrender if the emperor was allowed to stay. Now, the Americans eventually allowed this, but the problem is the Americans are absolutely dedicated to republics as the ideal form of government, and they see an international intervention which doesn't create a republic at the end of it as almost being pointless. Things would be much better in the Middle East right now if America was prepared to put in a king of Iraq or a king of Afghanistan. But because we have retard Americans governing world global policy, we don't get those sorts of sensible things. You look at the Middle East, you look at countries that are run by kings as opposed to presidents, they're run much better. And that is true globally. Monarchies are much better off than republics. And but the Americans are sort of humming and hawing, and the Japanese are reluctant, but they're prepared to surrender. And then they drop the bomb on Hiroshima. Now the Japanese really are ready to surrender if they weren't before. But the problem is that they're not surrendering quickly enough. So they drop the bomb on Nagasaki. I think Jeff's coming and going. I'm nearly done. And it's at this point with the dropping of the bomb on Nagasaki that the emperor personally steps in and demands the surrender of Japan. He goes on radio, and it's the first time. It's the first time anyone hears his voice, and they sign the surrender on the USS. Is it USS Iowa? Which is a slap in the face to the great state of New Jersey, because the USS Iowa was chosen because I think it's the Iowa. The USS Iowa was chosen because it was Eisenhower's home state, and so they wanted to use that. But the rules of war, the sort of honor of war, means that usually in situations like that, the fighting vessel with the most honors earned in that conflict is the ship where the surrender ought to be signed. And the USS New Jersey, the great state of New Jersey, had the best fighting record of the war. And so they snubbed the USS New Jersey and they signed it on USS Iowa. And that was that. That was the war. I think some little conflicts raged on for a little bit, and some big things came out of that immediately. The partition of India, the creation of Israel, the emergence of China, but that is stuff for another day. And that's the Second World War speed run, as given by Quigley. Yeah, and I'm tired of talking. I realized there was less sort of like juicy bits today, but what the important thing to take away from this is the growth of American production and the naivety of American foreign policy, the destruction of the British, and the sort of propping up of the Soviets, and the destruction of the three revisionist powers as revisionist powers. But yeah, I can keep going. I love this episode. I love this material. And I could keep going on about it. I could go very in depth about it. But that's not the point. Okay, Jeff, do you want to, if your mic's not good, do you want to run? I can see chat, so if there are any questions. Laurentian Canada was at both, I think. Canada was significantly at both. How has that indomitable spirit of the British changed compared to now? It's still there, or has the modern times really taken? The modern times have really taken its toll. You can see this in, I think it's 1956. You can see the British backbone is gone, because the British youth come out on the streets and they protest against the Suez intervention. The British, French, and Israelis get together and they orchestrate this event. Nasser has seized the Suez Canal from the French and British illegally. He seizes it illegally. There's no question about that. The British get together and the British and French get together with the Israelis, and they go secretly. They go, you start a war with the Egyptians. You take the Sinai Peninsula, and we'll intervene, and we'll take the Suez Canal in the interests of peace, and it'll be ours again, and we'll prevent the Egyptians from attacking you from the west. And this is very quickly seen through, but for the sake of the story, what's significant is the British youth protest against the war, and they say, like, we're not going to go and die in the Middle East for you guys. I think part of the reason why the indomitable spirit has disappeared is also because, like, for what purpose? We were doing something great when we went, out east of Suez, brought civilization at deepest, darkest Africa, and there was some romance to it, and there was some point to it, and now it's obvious that the point of these interventions are not about some great civilizational mission. They're not about the glory of empire. They're about lining the pockets of the globalists and and there's something. It sounds it sounds stupid, but like, there's some pointless nobility does not need to be like materialized in any tangible benefit. And so there's some nobility to an empire that costs us more than we ever got out of it and is just done for the sake of glory and greatness. Us intervening in Iraq with the Americans is pointless. Why? There's no glory there. I suppose the last bit of glory that we got was Falklands. Why was Quigley not published at first? The first book that Quigley writes is The Anglo-American Establishment. he sends it off to publishers, and people say that they're not interested. Now, it's thought that they're not interested because it's got lots of explosive material in it. That may or may not be true. I also think it's because Quigley is as interesting as he is and as useful as he is. He sometimes is not a good writer. He gets bogged down in minutia. It can be very dry, and I don't think the Anglo-American establishment is written particularly well for all the really important information it has. So I think that's the main. I think honestly, it's more that there are guys who have been part of the Council on Foreign Relations who talked about Quigley after his death, and people were like, "Was Quigley ever part of the Council of Foreign Relations?" And they were like, "No." And I mean, I'm taking them at face value. He goes, "No, he never was. He was basically, they just say like Quigley was a fanboy. He really liked it." And Quigley was massively pro Council on Foreign Relations. He thought that America engaging in this sort of shadow war liberal globalism was good because it was being done for the right reasons. He genuinely believed in the project of American globalism. He thought, though, that it looked a bit more like Kennedy, and he's really depressed when Kennedy dies because Kennedy's very pro America intervening globally to help countries get going, not Iraq, not not where's somewhere else. I can't think of it. Not like the constant American messing up of South America. One of the areas JFK really wants to like reform is South America. He really thinks the Latin American states are a tragedy that we can do something about, but not via funding reactionary governments against communist insurgents. That we've got to build these economies, we've got to make them liberal democracies, and Kennedy is more inspirational. In what way? But Quigley's much more Kennedy, and that vision that Kennedy represents disappears with his assassination, and it's why they kill him because because Kennedy's a threat to the order that the more the less idealistic globalists want. There's two, maybe maybe you want to say there's two factions of globalists. There's true believer globalists who they really believe in it and they really think it's the right way to do things. And then there's cynical globalists. And the cynical globalists are LBJ and Bell helicopters. And the idealistic globalists are Kennedy and there's a lot to be said there. I'd quite like to do. I don't want to steal the Substack's thunder, Jeff, but I'd like to do a stream on Gladio too. Yeah. Anything else? I'm happy to take more questions. The Anglo-American establishment is coming in, I think it's chapter 19. What I'm going to do, the Anglo-American establishment as a book stops around the Second World War. Quigley fleshes out, because it's written in 1948, Quigley has 15 years between the writing of the Anglo-American establishment and Tragedy and Hope. He doesn't talk much about the Anglo-American establishment on the American side in the Anglo-American establishment. He does in Tragedy and Hope. And I'm going to what I'm planning on doing is the bit in Tragedy and Hope that he talks about the Anglo-American establishment. I'm going to cut around that, and I'm not going to mention the Anglo-American establishment in that chapter episode. Rather, what I'm going to do is the week after do an episode on that bit of the chapter and the book, The Anglo-American Establishment. Well, it's interesting you say that, Laurentian, because apparently the funding for The Godfather was wrapped up with Operation Gladio, and it suggested that it sort of the Operation Gladio system self-aggrandizing themselves and being, look at how cool we are, look at The Godfather. But I'm the Operation Gladio guys funded The Godfather. Oh, that's what you're saying, isn't it? Yeah. The other thing I want to get into is the Rand Corporation. I made a connection with the Rand Corporation. The Rand Corporation is very tied up with the American side of operational research. I plan on doing a lot of work and reading around operational research. Um, it's very interesting stuff, and the I think the impulse is to say operational research bad because of like the doors it unlocks. I think it's a I don't want to say that. I think it's not bad. It's how you it's the nervous system of systems that develop, entities that develop to a level of complexity that they need a dedicated nervous system operating them. That's what operational research is. And it's really like the Second World War is a war that's fought at a level of complexity and sophistication and logistics and targets that it really needs a nervous system developed. And maybe you want to say this is like Ellul's technique, but the technique of managing the system, the technique is the nervous system, the sort of the mind coordinating the body. Yeah, cybernetics. You need these things to operate the body, because if the body is not operated by this nervous system, it's not going to work. Or if it is going to work, it's going to be really sloppy. And as the British discovered, we're not going to be able to go one for one with the Germans. We need to find force multipliers. And one of the ways that they found a force multiplier was a more efficient coordination of their forces than the Germans. And that's what cybernetics is. That's what operational research is. That's what managerialism is. You might want to say, like, we shouldn't let things get so big. That's great. I'm with you. You know, small is beautiful. The Schumacher book, right? There's a beauty to scale, and it's what I find. I think so many people find appealing about the model of the Shire. But also, we have to realize we're not in that place in time. We are here and now, and whether we like it or not, we have these mammoth scales that we have to live with. And I don't know whether you'd want to say it's I could see it cutting either way. It's better or worse having OR, managerialism, cybernetics, technique, the pluralist economy. It's better having that there. If we've got to have the mammoth, it's better that the mammoth at least is like has good hand-eye coordination. I could see that argument. I could also see the argument of, no, the more the behemoth can coordinate, the worse it is for us. I see both sides to it, but ultimately, I think it's not the fall. It's not, but it's like a minor fall. One of my friends told me, my Orthodox friend described. There's an idea in Orthodoxy of minor falls, these little falls that are sort of symbolic of the fall. And he was saying like cryptocurrency is like according to this Orthodox priest. I can't remember who it was. This is a minor fall, right? The use of like credit cards, the cashless society is a minor fall. Well, cybernetics but we have to use them as well. And the implication I think you might want to make here, the connection you might want to make is these are minor falls that we have to live with, and our job is to navigate this world and these minor falls that are being forced on us without losing our souls. And yeah, parochialism wins. Yep. Although the thing that scares me is it's like this tension between domestication and non-domestication, and we're on the side of no, we don't want to be domesticated, and that's great, and I'm gonna stick with that side. But in the domestication versus non-domestication, the domestication versus wild battle, you see a lot more dogs than wolves. So as much as I'm not gonna let myself be domesticated, I also realize what that might lead to. Well, my voice is getting a bit tired. Jeff is not on the call. I think I'll cut it. I'll do it there. But what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna play. Jeff, can I get away with playing another YouTube video, a quick one of this Battlefield 1942 theme, or do I need to keep it unwindowed? Like just the sound. Yeah. Okay, let's see if I can do this then. Let's see, 1 second. All right. This is my favorite game from a certain period. I hope you had a good time, guys, and we'll see you soon.